Young Timothy Fairbanks, at 16, was a master of blending into the brick walls of Oakhaven Academy. With his thin build, unruly auburn hair that perpetually obscured his blue eyes, and a habit of gazing at the floor as he moved, he slipped through the busy halls like a ghost. His scuffed boots whispered against the polished concrete floors, and his threadbare jacket sagged from his bony frame as he navigated between groups of boisterous pupils. Timothy had started at Oakhaven just 2 months prior, when his dad secured a job at the local mill. Beginning junior year at a fresh place was tough enough, but Timothy carried added weights that made him an obvious mark. His clothes were second-hand, his lunch was a simple cheese sandwich he made himself, and his shy nature made him seem vulnerable to those who thrived on control. The first time Barnaby Grimshaw noticed Timothy, it was in the study hall during the initial week. Barnaby stood well over 6 feet tall, with a thick neck built from years of rugby, his dark hair always perfectly combed, and his designer clothes labeling him as one of the wealthy kids. He ruled his area of the social structure with an iron fist, surrounded by his dedicated mates who chuckled at his every word and joined in his nasty games. "Look at that poor excuse of a human," Barnaby had muttered to his pals, gesturing towards Timothy, who sat alone at a side desk, quietly reading a worn paperback. "I bet he's never even held a girl's hand." Peter Crumb, Barnaby's closest follower, smirked while adjusting his expensive wristwatch. With his sturdy body and constant frown, Peter acted as Barnaby's muscle, always eager to change words to fists. Probably couldn't land a hit if he tried. Look how frail he is. The third person in their group, Ashley Thorne, was shorter than the other two, but made up for it with cruel imagination in his bullying methods. His blonde hair was gelled back, and his eyes held a shrewd coldness that unsettled even some teachers. "We should greet the new boy properly," Ashley suggested with a wicked smile. Their initial tactic was delicate, deliberately knocking into Timothy in the corridors, making remarks just loud enough for him to overhear, and making sure he felt unwanted wherever he went. Timothy bore it silently, keeping his head down and hurrying to his lessons. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse, and he had secrets that required him to stay out of sight. What none of them realized was that Timothy came from a family with unusual talents. His grandmother had possessed empathic abilities that she'd kept hidden her entire life, and his father showed occasional hints of the same gift during times of extreme emotion. Timothy had always felt different, feeling odd feelings when his emotions ran high, but he'd learned to control these feelings after a childhood incident that had frightened his family. The bullying grew steadily over the following weeks. In the games field, Barnaby would accidentally barge into Timothy during football, sending him sprawling across the muddy grass while other pupils laughed. In the corridors, Peter would shoulder-check him into the notice boards, causing his books to spill and forcing him to rush to gather them before the next bell. Ashley specialized in mental torment, spreading lies about Timothy's family being broke and making sure everyone knew he wore hand-me-downs. Miss Abigail, Timothy's history teacher, noticed the signs, but felt unable to step in without clear proof. She watched as Timothy became more withdrawn, his participation in class discussions dropping to 0. Other teachers ignored the obvious harassment, either too busy with their own duties or unwilling to challenge the well-known pupils whose parents donated generously to the school. The breaking point came on a chilly Wednesday morning in late November. Timothy had stayed late after school to use the library's computer for a science report, knowing his family couldn't afford internet at home. As he walked through the empty corridors towards the main doors, he heard footsteps echoing behind him. His stomach sank as he recognized the voices. Barnaby, Peter, and Ashley were tailing him. "Hey, Fairbanks!" Barnaby called out, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Where do you think you're going in such a rush?" Timothy quickened his pace, but the 3 boys easily caught up to him near the main entrance. The corridor was deserted, most pupils and staff having left for the day. Dim lighting cast long shadows, creating an atmosphere of loneliness and vulnerability. "We've been watching you, weirdo," Peter sneered, blocking Timothy's way to the door. "Always sneaking around, thinking you're better than everyone else." "I just want to go home," Timothy said softly, his voice barely audible. He could feel something stirring deep inside him, a familiar warmth that made his skin prickle. He forced it down, the way he'd been taught since childhood. Ashley stepped closer, his cold eyes shining with cruel intent. "That's not how this works. You see, you've been ignoring us, and that's not acceptable." Barnaby cracked his knuckles menacingly. "We tried to be friendly, to welcome you to our school, but you just kept walking away. That was impolite." Timothy backed against the wall, trapped between the three boys and the stone barriers. His heart raced as he felt the familiar pressure building inside his head, the same sensation he'd felt as a child when his emotions went out of control. He closed his eyes and tried to stay calm, to keep the strange energy locked away where it couldn't hurt anyone. "Look at him," Peter laughed, mistaking Timothy's closed eyes as fear. "I think he's about to wet himself. Maybe he needs something to really give him a reason to cry," Ashley suggested, reaching into his satchel. What he pulled out made Timothy's blood freeze, a silver metal device with a red button that sparked with a faint glow. "Where did you get that?" Barnaby asked, impressed despite himself. "My dad's a park ranger. He won't miss it," Ashley replied, pressing the button that made the stun gun hum ominously. "I've been wanting to test this on someone." Timothy opened his eyes wide with terror. "Please don't. I won't tell anyone about this, I swear. Just let me go home." "Too late for that," Barnaby said, grabbing Timothy by the collar. "Hold him still, Peter." Peter seized Timothy's arms while Barnaby pinned him against the wall. Timothy struggled desperately, but he was no match for their combined strength. The pressure inside his head grew stronger, joined by a strange ringing sound that seemed to vibrate through his entire being. "This is going to be great," Ashley said, approaching with the stun gun raised. "I wonder how loud you'll scream." "Stop, please," Timothy pleaded, but his pleas only seemed to encourage them. Ashley pressed the stun gun against Timothy's shoulder and pushed the button. Thousands of volts of electricity surged through Timothy's body, causing him to jerk violently against the wall. But instead of the expected screams of pain, something else happened altogether. The electric shock didn't just travel through Timothy, it seemed to awaken something that had been sleeping within him. The carefully controlled energy he'd spent years suppressing suddenly burst outward like a volcano erupting. Every fluorescent tube in the corridor flickered and died simultaneously, plunging the four boys into darkness. The heavy wooden benches began to rattle and shake, their legs splintering with loud cracks. Barnaby and Peter released Timothy in shock, stumbling backward as the stone floor beneath their feet began to vibrate. Timothy stood against the wall, no longer the frightened victim, but something far more powerful. His eyes had changed, glowing with an unnatural golden light, and the air around him seemed to shimmer with heat. "What the heck?" Barnaby started to say, but his words were cut off as an invisible force lifted him off his feet and hurled him against the opposite wall. He slid down to the floor, gasping for air and staring at Timothy in disbelief. Peter tried to run, but the heavy oak door slammed shut before he could reach it. He pulled frantically at the handle, but it wouldn't move, as if locked in place. Behind him, the sound of wood groaning filled the air as the benches continued to bend and break under the influence of Timothy's unleashed power. Ashley still held the stun gun, but his hands were shaking as he watched his friends being tossed around by an invisible force. "This isn't possible," he whispered, backing away from Timothy. "This can't be happening." Timothy took a step forward, and with each movement, the intensity of the supernatural energy increased. Plaster began falling around them, and the emergency exit signs swayed dangerously overhead. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a depth that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the earth itself. "You wanted to see me break," Timothy said, his words echoing strangely in the ruined corridor. "You wanted to see me scared and helpless." Peter was pressed against the locked door, tears streaming down his face as he felt an intense pressure squeezing him from all sides. "Timothy, please, we're sorry, we didn't mean it." Barnaby struggled to stand, using the wall for support, but invisible hands kept pushing him back down. His expensive clothes were ripped, and blood dripped from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the stone blocks. "This is impossible, people can't do this." "You're right," Timothy replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Normal people can't do this. But you just discovered that I'm not normal." Ashley made a desperate attempt to use the stun gun again, lunging forward with the device extended, but it flew from his hands before he could make contact. The stun gun sailed through the air and embedded itself in the ceiling, its metal casing cracking from the impact. Timothy raised his hand, and all three boys were lifted simultaneously into the air. They floated helplessly, their feet dangling several feet off the ground, held in place by the sheer force of his will. The fear in their eyes was complete now, the same terror they had inflicted on others for years reflected back at them 100-fold. "For months, you've made my life miserable," Timothy continued, his voice steady despite the incredible power flowing through him. "You've humiliated me, hurt me, and made me hate coming to school every single day." "We'll stop," Barnaby pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We'll leave you alone. We'll never bother you again." "You'll do more than that," Timothy said, lowering them until their feet touched the ground, but keeping them pinned against the wall with invisible force. "You're going to understand what it feels like to be powerless." One by one, Timothy began to show the extent of his abilities. Peter's expensive wristwatch was torn from his wrist and crushed into an unrecognizable mess. Ashley's carefully styled hair was messed up by invisible hands, leaving him looking disheveled and vulnerable. Barnaby's designer jacket was ripped off and shredded, the pieces scattered across the debris-covered floor. But Timothy didn't stop with their possessions. Using his empathic powers with surgical precision, he began to give them a taste of the emotional pain they had dished out for so long. Barnaby found himself being bombarded with images of his own failures and insecurities, causing him to break down in tears. Peter was filled with the same sense of isolation and loneliness that Timothy had felt for months, making him realize the impact of his actions. Ashley was overwhelmed with the guilt and shame of his cruel behavior, feeling the pain he had inflicted on others as if it were his own. "Please stop," Ashley whimpered, overwhelmed by emotions and looking down at the destruction below. "I can't take it anymore." "Now you know how I felt every single day," Timothy replied, but there was no malice in his voice anymore, only a cold, calculated justice. "The difference is, I'm not a monster like you." He gently lowered Ashley to the ground, though he kept all three boys restrained against the wall. The supernatural energy around Timothy began to subside slightly, the golden glow in his eyes dimming to a more normal intensity. The rumbling in the building stopped, and the remaining intact lights flickered back to a steady glow. "Here's what's going to happen," Timothy announced, his voice returning to its normal tone, but carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "You're going to tell everyone at school exactly what happened here tonight. You're going to admit that you've been bullying me and that I defended myself." "No way," Barnaby protested weakly. "No one will believe this crazy story anyway." Timothy smiled for the first time in months, but it wasn't a kind expression. With a subtle gesture, he caused one of the destroyed benches to splinter further, the wood groaning in protest. "Do you really want to test me on that?" Barnaby's defiance crumbled instantly. Okay, we'll tell them whatever you want. I want you to tell them the truth," Timothy corrected. that you three have been terrorizing an innocent pupil, and that when you escalated to using a weapon on me, you discovered that some fights aren't worth picking. Peter, still pressed against the wall, nodded frantically. Yes, we'll tell everyone. We'll make sure they know we were wrong. And you'll make sure no one else gets bullied in this school, Timothy continued, the invisible force holding them beginning to ease slightly. You'll use your influence to protect other pupils instead of hurting them. Ashley, back on solid ground, but still unable to move freely, looked around at the destruction surrounding them. Broken glass, splintered wood, fallen plaster, and damaged walls bore testament to the incredible power that had been unleashed. How is this even possible? How long have you been able to do this? Timothy considered the question, remembering years of suppressing his abilities, of living in fear of what he might accidentally do if he lost control. I've always been different. My family taught me to hide it, to never let anyone know what I could do. But you three decided to bring weapons into this, and that changed everything. The realization of what they had awakened began to sink in. Barnaby looked around at the demolished corridor, understanding that this level of destruction could have been turned on them personally if Timothy had chosen to be truly vindictive. "We could have been killed," he whispered. "Yes," Timothy agreed simply, "but I'm not you. I don't enjoy hurting people who can't defend themselves." Slowly, Timothy released his empathic hold on the three boys. They slumped against the wall, their legs shaky from the adrenaline and terror of the past several minutes. None of them made any attempt to run or continue their attack. The fight had been completely taken out of them. "Go home," Timothy instructed, slinging his jacket over his shoulder. "Think about what happened here tonight. Think about all the other pupils you've hurt over the years. And tomorrow, you start making it right." As Timothy walked toward the main door, it swung open for him without any visible assistance. He paused in the doorway and looked back at his former tormentors, who were still staring at him in amazement and fear. "And if you ever touch another pupil the way you touched me," he added quietly, "remember what you've seen here tonight, because next time, I might not be so merciful." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Barnaby, Peter, and Ashley alone in the destroyed corridor. For several minutes, none of them spoke, each processing what they had witnessed and experienced. The silence was broken only by the occasional sound of settling debris and the distant hum of the building's electrical system. Word of the incident spread through Oakhaven Academy like wildfire over the next few days, though the story changed with each telling. Some pupils claimed there had been a structural collapse that caused widespread damage to the main entrance. Others whispered about a fight that had gotten out of hand, resulting in property destruction and injuries. But Barnaby, Peter, and Ashley kept their promise to Timothy. In a surprising turn of events, they called an assembly where they publicly admitted to months of bullying behavior and formally apologized not just to Timothy, but to several other pupils they had targeted over the years. Their confession shocked the pupil body and staff, many of whom had suspected the bullying but had never seen the three well-known pupils take responsibility for their actions. The damaged corridor was quickly repaired over the weekend, with the headmaster blaming the destruction on structural weakness caused by age. No questions were asked about how such weakness could have caused benches to bend and splinter into impossible shapes, or why the damage seemed to come from one specific spot. Timothy noticed the change in environment immediately. Pupils who had previously ignored him now nodded politely in the corridors. Teachers smiled at him more often and seemed genuinely interested in his academic progress. Even pupils he'd never spoken to began including him in discussions and asking him to sit with them at lunch. The change in Barnaby, Peter, and Ashley was perhaps the most amazing thing about the whole situation. Stripped of their cruel swagger and forced to face the results of their actions, they began to really change their behavior. Barnaby started using his natural leadership skills to organize anti-bullying programs. Peter put his protective feelings into defending younger pupils who were being picked on. Even Ashley, with his clever intelligence, began tutoring struggling classmates instead of finding new ways to make fun of them. 6 weeks after the incident, Timothy was walking to the bus stop after school when Barnaby approached him alone. The former bully looked uneasy but determined, his hands shoved deep in his pockets as he struggled to find the right words. "Timothy," Barnaby began slowly, "I know we already said sorry in public, but I wanted to talk to you privately too." Timothy paused, his bus pass in his hand, and looked at Barnaby's face for any sign of the old anger. What he saw instead was real sadness and something that might have been respect. "What did you want to say?" Timothy asked, his voice even but not unfriendly. Barnaby took a deep breath before speaking. "I wanted you to know that what happened that night, it changed everything for me. Not just because of what you could do, but because of what you chose not to do." Timothy waited quietly for him to keep going. "You could have really hurt us," Barnaby went on, his voice getting stronger with belief. "With that kind of power, you could have put us in the hospital or worse. But you didn't. You taught us a lesson instead of just getting even, and that says something about who you are as a person. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were," Timothy replied simply. Barnaby nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Peter, Ashley and I have been talking about that a lot lately. We wasted so many years being horrible to people who didn't deserve it. We can't take that back, but we can try to do better from now on." The two young men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both thinking about how much their relationship had changed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the nearly empty grounds, and somewhere in the distance, the sounds of after-school activities drifted on the autumn wind. "For what it's worth," Barnaby added, "I'm glad you're at our school now. Things are better with you here." As Timothy rode the bus home that afternoon, he thought about the strange turns his life had taken. For 16 years, he had lived in fear of his talents, sure that they made him dangerous and different in ways that would never be accepted. His family had taught him to hide his gifts, to keep them secret from a world that wouldn't understand. But the meeting with his bullies had taught him something important about power and responsibility. His empathic abilities weren't just a weight to be hidden, they were a part of who he was, and like any tool, their goodness depended entirely on how they were used. The incident had forced him to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. He could have used his powers for revenge, to become a bully himself with supernatural abilities that no one could resist. Instead, he had chosen to use them as a learning tool, to create understanding rather than just fear. Timothy knew that the real win hadn't been showing his hidden strength, it had been showing mercy when he could have chosen violence. By refusing to become the monster his tormentors had tried to make him, he had not only freed himself from their torment, but had actually helped them become better people. As he stepped off the bus, Timothy made a silent promise to himself. He would never again hide from who he was or be sorry for the gifts he had been given, but he would also never use those gifts to hurt innocent people or to get unfair advantages over others. Walking into his house, Timothy found his father waiting for him in the living room, his eyes filled with worry and understanding. He had sensed the change in him. The way the hidden energy that had always surrounded him had finally found balance and purpose. "Something happened today," he said, not quite a question. Timothy sat down across from him and for the first time in his life told his father everything about his abilities and what had happened at school. He watched as relief spread across his father's face, relief that his son had finally found the courage to be himself, and that he had chosen to use his power wisely. The days that followed brought a new normal to Oakhaven Academy. Timothy continued to do well in school, but now he took part more actively in class discussions and after-school activities. He joined the debate club, where his quiet intelligence and thoughtful arguments earned him respect from both teammates and opponents. The three former bullies became some of his most unlikely friends, their public change serving as an example to other pupils who had previously been cruel. The school's feeling grew noticeably more welcoming and supportive, with cases of bullying dropping sharply as word spread about the results of picking on innocent pupils. Timothy never had to use his empathic abilities again in a confrontational way. The knowledge that he had such power, along with his shown control in using it, was enough to earn him a reputation as someone who gained respect without needing fear. Years later, as Timothy prepared to graduate with honors, he would look back on that frightening November morning as the moment his real life began. The scared, hidden boy who had walked into Oakhaven Academy had been changed not by his supernatural abilities, but by his choice to use them responsibly. Standing at the podium to give his graduation speech, Timothy looked out at a crowd that included Barnaby, Peter, and Ashley, all of whom had become true friends and had earned their own forgiveness through years of changed behavior. His message to his fellow graduates was simple but deep. True strength comes not from the power to harm others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that power at all.